So let me start all the way down to my very right, DA Jose Garza. He is the district attorney, just won an incredible, tough primary against a Democratic, a more tough on crime challenger in his, about to be in his second term, I am sure. In Travis County, which is Austin, Texas, one of the biggest counties. Yes, I see some Texas fans in the room. I, too, am an honorary Texan. Lots of my family lives there. And what I'm really excited for Jose, and we're going to use first names here because we're family.
Yep.
What I'm really excited for Jose to bring to this panel is first, as a candidate and a politician, how do you counter fear and the right-wing agenda? And then when you govern, how do you actually counter that day-to-day and advance an agenda that, again, is about hope, optimism, and solutions? Terrence Woodbury, incredible pollster, co-founder of HIT Strategies, and if any of you have heard him on podcasts, in the news, quoted, and he is everywhere these days, you will know he is unafraid to tell some hard truths and accompany them with really obvious, smart solutions of what do we do. And I would say Terrence's work for me has been so transformative to say we can't pretend a problem isn't there when it comes to progressives, when it comes to the voters that we think we have in our fold. We have to keep earning voter trust. It is not to be assumed, and I think the work that Terrence does to say, here's how we win trust, is so powerful and so important for this moment, especially as we're thinking about the narratives of fear and how do we counter it. And then last not least, Imara Jones, who is an incredible political journalist, somebody who comes from having done policy in the White House to, for the past a few decades, really sort of launched an incredible narrative work project. Did you make a face to that? Sorry. It's in your bio. You can say, no, am I wrong about that?
I mean, what's a decade? But we'll just come to that.
Oh.
It's time.
But let's talk about what you are doing now, Imara, which is an incredible narrative project to really own identity, to fight back against transgender, fear-mongering, and to just more broadly really advance, like, how do we tell narratives that tell the story of America, our opportunity, our hope, and that include all of us. And so narrative change is so important to this conversation because we know this. We are winning on policy. We have policies that when we poll voters, we win every single time, and yet the narrative that needs to accompany policy isn't there, and there's a lot of reasons for that. So with that, Imara, I'm actually going to start with you, and you can talk about what you are doing now as opposed to something that is a few decades ago or a decade ago. But one of the things...
She's not going to let that go.
Well, I didn't see your face. So one of the things that I think is really powerful about your work is you have made really clear that the fear agenda isn't just there. It didn't just emerge from nowhere. It is actually built with infrastructure, with power, with money, with deliberation. So say a little bit about how has the right sort of infrastructure to create that agenda of fear, how was that built, and what are the lessons for us as progressives? And on the left, what do we do?
Yes, so I run an organization called Translash Media, which was founded in 2018.
Barely a decade ago.
And Translash is a narrative change organization that uses journalism and nonfiction storytelling to center the humanity of trans people in order to end violence and to save democracy. And those two things are inextricably linked. And we do so in as many ways as possible, and in two primary ways. We do so in ways that uplift the creativity, the joy, the power that trans people bring to the country right now. We had, for example, a nationwide documentary on PBS that aired on June 24th called American Problems, Trans Solutions. And then we also do so in another way, which is that we lay out the way in which the Christian nationalist movement is building us up into a population of people that are problematic, in order to justify and usher in an era of authoritarianism. And we try to do so and that primary body of work is through an investigative podcast series that we have called The Anti-Trans Hate Machine, A Plot Against Equality. That project began in 2020. It is now season 3 of Anti-Trans Hate Machine will launch in September of this year. And so what I'm about to tell you is going to center more on that body of work and is a result now of 4 years of us and the investigative unit that we have inside of Translash who is doing this sort of work. And if you want to just keep up with what we're doing, just go to translash.org and sign up for our newsletter. And each week you'll be hearing about all the amazing things that we're doing because we also have zines and a written platform and a political podcast, which I host called The Mess, Amara's Guide to Our Political Hellscape. So you can also sign up for that. I have no idea why we named it that. It's random. So I think the thing that's most important to think about is that fear fundamentally is not only something that the Christian nationalists and authoritarian movements use, it's actually where they live. Like, these are very deeply fearful people. And they genuinely believe that the world is a frightening and scary space. And that's why they believe that the country needs to be authoritarian on some range, including that driven by religion, Christian nationalism, in some way. So I don't want us to think that this is only a ploy. We are talking about people who this is their worldview, and this is literally where they live. Like this fear is where they live. And they don't understand why y'all aren't afraid, right? And they believe that it is their job for you to understand the way that the world is, for you to understand why they believe what they believe, because if you do, then you will naturally come to their side. Right? Like, it's not only a ploy. Progressives like to believe that people don't believe what they really believe, and I think you have to accept that when people tell you that they believe something, it's actually what they believe. You don't know more about what they believe than they do. So the thing that I think that's really important about the way in which trans people, 1% of the population, 1%, has been transformed into one of the top legislative priorities of the Republican Party, where there are now 620 anti-trans bills that have been introduced this year. Half the states have passed anti-trans legislation to deal with 1% of the population, is because they fundamentally, from this fear standpoint, believe that trans people are a fundamental threat to the rest of the country. Like, it's actually a belief. And they then have created an entire infrastructure to convince everyone of the same thing that they believe. And that infrastructure, I think one of the things that people have to think about is the result of a lot of intelligent brain work. We are not talking about dumb people. We are not talking about people who don't understand, like, the world around us. These people are not Luddites. They understand that we think that they're Luddites and that they believe that that's to their advantage, but they're not dumb. And one of the things that's happened is that because they are amazing cultural listeners, have spent the past decade bringing us to this conversation about trans people. Where we are is not an accident, it's by design. It's the result of a lot of poll testing and focus grouping. It's the result of a lot of message testing. It's the result of a lot of organization and mobilization of billionaires, of think tanks like the Heritage Foundation behind Project 2025. And there's a lot of energy that has brought us to this point. And so I think that when we think about the conversation of fear, we have to understand that it has two purposes. It is both meant to change the conversation about what matters, because if we're talking about those things, they know that it would automatically shift the political conversation. See how wrong they are. And secondly, they know that it can be politically advantageous to do so. Because, for example, in this conversation about trans people, fear-mongering about trans people is fairly easy because we live in a transphobic society. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you have not grown up transphobic in America in some way, then something's wrong, because you probably should have, right? And they know that transphobia, disguised as the conversation around protecting kids, which has been poll tested. The American Principles Project did a lot of work around that and gave them that talking point, and a whole strategy, by the way. That they understand that if you talk about it as protection, then you can actually create conversations with people who are transphobic but don't want to appear bigoted. And they know that it creates conversations that people that they would never be in conversation with. They know that it creates conversations with them with suburban moms. They know it creates conversations for them with a whole host of a part of the lesbian community in the United States. They know that it creates conversations with Black churches and evangelical Latino churches that they would never, ever normally be able to be in conversation with. And they know that they need some small groups of those people to win. And that's because in the United States, out of 130 million votes that were cast in the last election in 2020, Joe Biden actually won by 45,000 votes. 45,000 votes in 3 states that switched, and it would be a different president and a different ballgame. And so the electoral strategy of fear around issues where you can mask what you're trying to do will allow you to shave off just enough votes in order to win. I think the margin of victory for Donald Trump in 2016 in Michigan was 2 votes per precinct. 2 votes per precinct. So do you believe that somehow fear-mongering around trans people can get you 2 votes per precinct? I think that their answer is yes.
Yeah.
And so I think that we have to understand this fear as both a part of a belief and as a part of a political strategy, and one that is comprehensive in nature by a very intelligent and well-resourced group of people.
I really appreciate the reminder that and it's sobering that it's not just a ploy, because I think you're right. Many of us treat it like a ploy, and so there is just a political strategy to unploy that, but that actually it's much deeper than that. Terrence, I'm going to turn to you next, because in your focus groups and in your polling, I have heard you say, and I think it is a really important alarm to sound, where the right wing messaging and talking points that are harnessing fear around the sort of idea of American identity, whatever that means, around freedom, around order and chaos. Those talking points aren't just making it to right-wing audiences, but in fact are sort of infiltrating everybody. So say a little bit about how that is happening, where that is happening, and then I think what we've found in some of the polling and research work that we've been doing specifically around countering sort of the fear-mongering on crime and turning the conversation to safety and justice, that the fear conversation only is potent when it's left unchecked.
That's exactly right.
And so I'd love for you to speak about that too, because I know that you and many others are like, there is actually a strategy, there's a narrative strategy that we can deploy if we were willing to have the courage of our convictions to do it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Thank you so much, and Jen, thank all of you for being here. I just have to state this at the top here, that for some reason my head just started spinning as we started this conversation. I don't know if it's the lights or the last 3 days of travel, but I hope what's coming out of my mouth is more succinct than the way it's floating in my head. So bear with me a little bit here. We have been seeing this since 2016, that the rhetoric from the right is infiltrating all of our politics. Both the fear which is, to your point, not just a tactic or a ploy, it is a paradigm shift. It's changing the world in which people live in. And we are not living in the same world. Americans are not all living in the same world, and the media environment that we live in determines the world that we live in, right? And so, and that's what I've learned sitting in focus groups every single night. I live in Washington, D.C., but I like to remind people, I work in America, and there are different Americas happening right now. And sitting in these focus groups gives us a vantage point and a finger on that pulse. And so we see that the fear narrative, that the fear mongering is beginning, it has been penetrating our side, but we also see how the zero-sum politics, how because they are getting more, we are getting less. And there's an interesting shift here that we're beginning to observe, which is that the zero-sum does not just apply to positive benefits that we feel like we have lost. That the zero-sum of they are getting the things that I wish I had, that it also applies to a negative transfer, right? And I'll give you an example of that, and this is how masterful Donald Trump and a lot of the right have become. And we've seen this, this connection that they are beginning, that he's beginning to make between crime and immigration, right? And that this is the evolution of his crime narrative, is that, you know, it is immigrants that are inflicting this crime on our communities. But what that has even done in the Black community is, see, look, it's not us, right? That's the zero-sum transfer of the negative implication, that if it's them doing the crime, then it's not us doing the crime. And so we have to continue to combat this in all ways. And I do want to give some credit because we have seen a narrative shift in this country, especially since the summer of 2020. That narrative shift is being driven by the folks in this room, is being driven by advocacy groups like Vera and by activist groups like Campaign Zero and Black Lives Matter. It is not being driven by politicians. In many ways, politicians have continued to oftentimes seed the narrative on public policy, on crime and public safety. Because what we know is that we don't have to continue to cede and lose on crime. We actually do win on public safety. And that crime will continue to be a top issue across every election cycle. It is a top 3 issue for at least a third of the electorate in this cycle. But we also know that that their perceptions of crime do not match reality, right? That 80% of voters say that crime is getting worse. 80%. Here's the crazy stat, is that 90% of those people have not experienced crime. You know, and so we know that the perception is not matching reality, and that perception is being driven by the narrative, and that narrative is only allowed to thrive in the absence of a counter-narrative. Misinformation only thrives in the absence of information. And so we not only have to continue to combat and be on the defense for these narratives, but we have to continue to go on offense and not just fight on their terms, but continue to change the terms of the debate so that we can win on public safety and not lose on crime.
Yeah. Also, if you're not feeling well, this is a place where you can go, just take care of yourself first. That's important.
I appreciate it.
Yeah. That's such a great setup for Jose, for the DA of Travis County, because to that point of, you know, playing upon fear and this fear of crime, which is really about safety, right? We all want fundamentally the freedom to be safe. And that folds into many other freedoms that we feel like Democrats and progressives are actually doing a great job messaging on, like abortion right now. That is one place I point to all the time to say, everybody is on message, they are loud, they are not ceding ground, and it is working. We are seeing that since 2022 and the Dobbs decision. So can we take a lesson from that and actually apply it to things like crime, to things like the backlash and the sort of fear-mongering around trans people? Like, we actually do have an example in recent history that really works for us. And then I actually think, to your point, Terrence, The narrative, by and large, is really being driven by organizers, advocates, people on the ground, and not nearly enough by politicians. Jose, I would say you are, for me, one of the key sort of exceptions to that trend, because you won in 2020, and then you won your primary again earlier this year, not by being silent or sort of moving away from the soft on crime attacks, not by doubling down and being like, I too am tough on crime, which is what we usually see as a response from the left. It's like, okay, how do I make myself more like my opposition? Will that work? No, it won't. We've seen that time and time again. Talk about what you did in your race, and then every day as you govern, as the lead prosecutor and the person responsible for safety in Austin. How do you actually own a narrative that, at least by all accounts, seems to be working, even though you have a state legislature that's in your backyard that is working hard and successfully passing legislation to make your job harder every day?
Whew.
So much there.
How's everyone doing this morning? Good. I'm really energized to be here. I'm really excited to be here with all of you because, first and foremost, it doesn't have to be this way, right? We know that we have the power to fix this, to beat back these challenges, to beat back this fear agenda. And as I look across the room, I know that these are our happy warriors to win this fight and to get this done. I want to talk a little bit about our recent political history, nationally and regionally. I want to talk a little bit about the substance of our work as progressives, and then do my best to answer the question about how I, as an elected official, govern in the face of all of this. First, the Republicans and the conservative infrastructure in our country using a fear agenda is not new. We have to acknowledge that they have used that agenda to devastating effect for about the last 200 years. But through the course of those last 2 centuries, we have had significant forward progress. We have won significant gains in the face of that onslaught. As recently in 2020, as we just talked about, and I think as everyone experienced, then President Trump relied almost exclusively on a tough on crime, fear-mongering message, and voters rejected that message across the country. In my own state, in Texas, in the largest county in the state, Harris County, home of Houston, Texas, we saw a coordinated Republican effort to outspend our county judge 5-1 on a message of fear-mongering, where they talked consistently about crime reaching crisis levels in Houston, Texas. Voters in that county rejected that message. One of my favorite colleagues across the country, Larry Krasner, in 2021, also faced a concerted effort, the largest expenditure by his police union in a long time in that city, and won his election with 65% of the vote. As you heard in my own race in March of this year, I was outspent 9-1 with a message. My constituents got a mailer with a child holding a bloody teddy bear with an adult's hand over his mouth. That is the kind of messaging that voters were receiving. And I was really honored and privileged to win that election with 67% of the vote. I think, and you are giving, I hope, yourselves a round of applause when you clap. I hope you are giving the voters of Travis County and voters all over this country a round of applause when you clap, because that was their victory, that was your victory, because we are smarter than that. We have seen this playbook before, and the reality is that we are right on the issues. We have to be confident in them. For all of his shortcomings, for all of his failings, and there may be panels on this throughout the day, Joe Biden has been the public safety president. Starting in 2020, crime began to rise all across this country. And on his watch, with progressive district attorneys in almost every major city in the country, crime has fallen through the floor. And it is not just good luck. It is because we are right on policy, because progressive policies make us safer. What we have seen from the top and what we have seen in communities across the country are significant investments in education, in healthcare, in mental health care. And at the end of the day, we know that that's what public safety is. It's access to good jobs. It's access to good schools to send our children. It's access to healthcare and mental health care. What public safety is stability. And our movement, the Democratic Party has invested significantly in that kind of infrastructure over the last 3 years, and this country is as safe as it has ever been as a result. In my job on a day-to-day basis, the number one thing I can do to answer your question is to take public safety seriously and to offer real solutions. For so long, we have heard the same tired message from our opposition. We have received the same tired solution, which is that if we want to be safe, all we have to do is lock up more people, and by the way, almost exclusively people of color and working class people, and we have to lock them up for longer. And if we do those things, we will be safer. We know that that is false. We know that that is a singular policy solution, has failed, and we know that our approach works. And so we have to be confident that our approach works, and we can't be afraid to talk about the success, afraid to talk about our progress. Gun violence poses a real public safety threat all across this country. It's why in Travis County we adopted a comprehensive plan that both invests in data-driven, community-based solutions and improves the ability of law enforcement to solve gun crimes. We know that domestic violence poses a real public safety threat to far too many people. In my community, a plurality of all homicides arise out of domestic violence. And it is why we started one of the first in the country program that begins to address violence in the home at its root, at its cause, so that we can address this challenge. We know that the underreporting and under-prosecution of sexual assault is a real problem in this community, is a real threat to our public safety. That's why we worked with survivors of sexual assault in my community to make sure that survivors are treated with dignity and respect, and so that we can improve outcomes. Progressive policies improve public safety, and we have got to lean into that.
So I'm going to name the thing that is hard for us as progressives and where I think the challenge is, Jose, I couldn't agree more that everything you said is actually right on point when it comes to making communities safe.
But
Yet the overall narrative that the left has on this issue of how do we own that we have real solutions, that we know what works, it's either silent because we are so afraid of being called soft on crime for actually having a different message that is not tough on crime, but is about safe communities. And likewise, we often retreat and are afraid when other issues of identity and sort of culture come into sharp relief, as opposed to leaning in and actually appealing to the humanity of all of us, because everybody can feel it and see it when you name it, but that's where fear actually hampers us. And so, one of the things, I'll just give a plug for some of the research and the polling and the messaging work that we have been doing through Vera Action. Terrence knows us as a close partner with us on much of this research, and then we've worked with folks like Jose and other elected leaders.
I think I just stole some of that messaging for this.
I love it. I was like, you are on message. And then thinking through how do we actually get the right kind of narrative about what it means to be safe and to own safety. And let me just give you a couple of key takeaways from our research and just the messaging frame that we have found works. For one thing, tough on crime is something that we can date it to the Willie Horton ad in 1988, but it's actually tough on crime has been the rhetoric and the fear agenda in terms of politics and crime and the electoral cycle for time immemorial. We know this. And by both parties. The Republicans actually do not have a lock on that. It is something we have watched Democrats do and deploy shamelessly as well. And in our polling, what we've found is that voters actually don't think tough on crime works. Even voters who are very worried about crime say, I've heard that and it doesn't work, because those policies feel to me like scare tactics. They are designed to make me afraid, as opposed to real solutions that make sure my kid goes to school and comes home okay, that I am safe in my neighborhood, that we can lead a regular, stress-free life, just being out and about in our business. So I think it's really important to know, tough on crime does not work. It does not sell. Neither party is above water, meaning neither party hits 50% or higher in terms of voter approval in their handling of crime and safety. Democrats lag behind Republicans by a margin of 10 to 15 percentage points in every poll we see, not because the policies of the left don't work when it comes to safe communities, but because voters don't hear them. The volume gap, the silence, is our biggest problem. And let me tell you just how much of a problem it is. Go back to 2022, where, if you all remember, this time last year, Democrats were up in the polls because we were right after Dobbs. Voters were angry. And each Democrat running in local elections to congressional elections were up in the polls. Come Labor Day, the GOP unveils their tough on crime, I'm going to play upon fear of crime, and that was everywhere. The GOP spent $157 million in just one election cycle in 2022 on congressional races, fear-mongering about crime. You know how much Democrats spent? Close to nothing. Like, that's just one very concrete example of the volume gap and where we only can go up if we lean in. And then the third is what we say matters. And we have tested and tested and tested a message that's as pithy as tough on crime, and here's what it is it's not about being tough or soft on crime, it's about being serious about safety. We can have safety, we can have accountability, we can have justice. That resonates, and what it does is it actually holds independent and older voters, and it motivates young voters and black voters to get out and to vote for a particular candidate, because you're speaking my language. I care about justice. I also care about safety. I don't believe that it's one or the other. I don't believe that false choice. Again, fear doesn't work when it is countered with a message that is about hope, optimism, and solutions. And so as we wrap up and as we open it up for Q&A, so start thinking about your questions, and we're going to have somebody, there's a mic in the back, run around, raise your hand, jump in. I want to ask each of you, what would one thing you would suggest for folks in this room, organizers, advocates, policy folks, what would you suggest we do to counter fear in this moment, knowing that we are staring down November 5th, 2024? Anyone want to go first? You want to go?
Yeah, I really quickly, I think I would say two things. I think the first thing that I would say is kind of where I ended, which is to take this seriously, right? And what I mean by that is that if you have an organizing strategy without a narrative strategy, then you're trying to fly a plane with one wing. And I think that there has to be very focused energy around beginning to create and seed narratives in ways that are large and small. So I would task people to begin to think about that within your organization, within networks of people. There are actually several sort of narrative change think tanks that are, one is actually based in DC. There's some others that you can reach out to and say, how do we actually structure narrative? I think that that's really important. And if you're funders, you should start funding narrative change organizations that are progressive, period, full stop.
I think we have to continue to change the terms of the debate. We have to, stop trying to beat them on crime and continue to advance our narrative on public safety and being serious on safety. I think we have to continue to, own the wins. Crime is going down. That is a win, right? I often compare crime stats to like gas prices, We got a camera on them as long as they're going up. There's a reporter out there with a camera on those gas prices, showing them go up tick, penny by penny by penny every day. But when they go down by $1, we recorded them going up by a penny, but we missed when they went down by $1. Yeah. And it's the same thing that's happening with crime stats, right? We have a camera on every single example of crime, but we do not promote our wins. And a part of that I've learned from Democratic leadership and electeds is that we don't want to appear to wave a mission accomplished sign when people are still in pain. Just because the gas prices went down doesn't mean that they're not still too high. It's the same thing with crime stats. Just because they're going down doesn't mean that they're not still too high. But we have to own those wins because it's the only way to demonstrate the efficacy that what we are saying actually works. And then the last thing I'll say is that we have to continue to draw a connection between some of these issues, the same way they're doing between, the same way they are inaccurately doing between crime and immigration. The fact that Democrats, have a 20-point advantage on gun safety and a 20-point disadvantage on crime means that there's a disconnection in these issues. We have to continue to connect our gun safety policies, which have overwhelming majority approval, with the ability to improve public safety. Mm-hmm. And then the last one is reject the false choice between public safety and police accountability. That is an FOP, that is a bullshit narrative of the FOP. That either we can keep you safe or you can hold us accountable. Voters reject that. Voters know that we can do both, and we have effectively done both. And we need narrative that demonstrates that.
Yeah, love that. I will just add from our polling, we've done a bunch of exit polls in cities, mayoral races where crime was the top issue. So Chicago last year, Philly last year, and we actually asked this question about what voters think of various institutions. People don't like the FOP. They actually see it for what it is, which is a special interest. And I actually think that is, again, a wisdom that we need to impart to politicians, that coveted police endorsement actually isn't for voters what you think it is. So I think that is such a good point.
If I could just add one thing to that, we
course.
do need, one thing that that the right does effectively is identify a villain, and that villain is often us, people of color, immigrants. You know what I mean? Like they make their villain really clear. The police are not the villain. No. The police are not the villain. Americans will not accept that from the left. They will not accept villainizing police as the bad guy. FOP, that's a different kind of villain.
Yeah. Smart.
I'm glad you made that point. I think I will send my message to my colleagues in elected office across the country, and in particular to elected prosecutors across the country. And I do, just to emphasize Terrence's point, you talked about crime statistics and gasoline prices, and there's often this thought that, but if we're honest about it, do we really have anything to do with gas prices? But I do want to say this clearly. When it comes to declining crime rates, we did that.
That's right.
Those are the direct results of progressive policies from the national level down to the local level, and we have to lean in and own that success, in part, if for no other reason, because if we do not, and if we fail this November, all of the gains we have made will be erased, and we will see the result of those gains being erased on our public safety, on our ability to be and feel safe in our communities. So that's just the first point I wanted to make. But to my colleagues across the country, it is time to lean in, to be bold, to own the fact that our approach works, that it is successful, and I would just implore my colleagues not to retreat on public safety.
Yeah. So follow Trans/Media, follow Hit Strategies, shout out to folks like Jose who are standing up for what's right in elected office and leaning in on the campaign trail. And join me in a big round of applause for our incredible panelists. And then The wonderful Mathoni Wambu Kral is walking around with a mic. I see a question there. I will just shout out people if I miss your hand, because these lights are really bright. Just yell. There you go.
They are.
Hi, first I just want to say thank you so much for your remarks and your preparation today, and I know you're not feeling well, so thank you for hanging in there. So I guess Mr. Garza talks about like it's important for us to lean in and be bold, and I try to show up in spaces and be authentic. And I feel like there is a disservice to credit. First of all, I think it's interesting. We talk about like the fear agenda and defeating it, and I'm curious to know the word progressive has been kind of thrown around kind of liberally in the room. And like I consider myself a progressive. I don't know if I would align with police or prosecutors per se. So I think, and I wonder if that's a question that even matters really, like who is the who, like defining who are we and like what are our values. But going back to like, I'm a staff attorney at a DC civil rights nonprofit, and I'm a movement lawyer where I work with directly impacted people who are impacted by carceral institutions like the DA's office and jails and prisons. And I think about the organizing wins that have led us to this moment as well. I don't know if I would credit it to like national policy solely. I think for folks who don't have privilege or the ability to be in this room today, I just feel like it's remiss to not talk about organizing wins that are responsible for public safety. I also wanted to respond directly to a comment you made, Mr. Garza, about Joe Biden being like the public safety president. I think you said that. You also said that locking up Black and brown people for a long time is not a solution. Joe Biden also said, like, we need to fund police. And I guess for me, when we talk about narratives, the implications of saying he is the public safety president and crime is down, but he advocates for inflating police budgets, are we saying police keep us safe? We said police are not villains, and I'm not here to like soapbox. It's just, I'm curious. I'm leading into a place of curiosity because as a Black queer woman and the people I work with in the trans community and people who are houseless, police officers are often violence workers, and I want to give truth to those narratives as well. I'm curious to know, from your work as a prosecutor, your choice of being a prosecutor, how do you define your office's work as progressive? And maybe people who don't agree with you or people who are more left of center, where can we work together on some issues without it being a value compromise? Yeah. And thank you for my question in advance.
First of all, thank you for your question, and thank you for identifying, I think, all of those tensions. I just want you to know that on a personal level, I feel them every day. I started my career as a public defender on the Texas-Mexico border. I ran a worker center before I became district attorney, but I thought it was a natural transition, so here I am. It's a joke, obviously. But the point is that I also struggle with the system within which I work, what that system was designed to do and what it does on a daily basis. And when I say those things, I mean the real and direct harm it causes predominantly, as I said, to communities of color, predominantly to working class communities all across this country, and finally, the way it fails on a daily basis to actually keep us safe. The things that I identify in my office first of all, let me just acknowledge we have a long way to go. But I am proud of the progress that we have made. We have reduced prison sentences coming out of my office since I've taken office by almost 40%. 30% of all felony cases going through my office now result in dismissal. Those are, we should be honest and transparent, and for those live tweeting, those are predominantly nonviolent offenses. We have work to do to end our belief that incarceration is the only solution for people who engage in violence as well, and I think we're starting that process. And I could talk about this all day, so I'm going to try to be brief and would love to catch up a little bit more. Let me just tell you about two other quick pieces of work. I alluded to a project that we started earlier this summer, but we have effectively ended the arrest of children for the number one reason that children are arrested in my community, which is assault, family violence, and instead are supporting those young people and their families through restorative justice programs. We are about to launch a gun violence diversion program that can end convictions for people accused of firearm violence, because it will improve our long-term public safety. So let me just make one more point, and then I will stop, but I loved your question. Let me also just acknowledge the real tensions that exist with this administration. And trust me, I feel them every day when it comes to immigration. The president, I implored my fellow elected officials not to retreat on public safety. I'm not sure the president has always done that, but I'm trying to speak it into existence. And while it is true that he did call for and manage significant investments in law enforcement, he also called for and managed significant investments in community violence intervention and CVI work that I think has done a great deal to reduce gun violence and empowers communities to solve the challenges we face. So I want to be clear that please do not hear me to be saying he has been in anywhere close to perfect, but when I think about the threats looming in 2024, I feel compelled to make sure that he and we all get credit for being the public safety thinkers.
I want to offer just one more quick thing there. So the State of the Union 2022 was when Joe Biden went unscripted and said, fund the police, fund them, fund them. It was the only memorable thing from that State of the Union. Let's be real, it got a ton of media coverage. And then you fast forward to the State of the Union 2023. It was a month after the murder of Tyree Nichols by 5 police officers in Memphis, Tennessee. Tyree Nichols' parents were in the audience. And we know that many folks, the Congressional Black Caucus, we worked with them, other folks were saying to the president, you cannot get up there and talk about police and say, fund the police, fund them. And we watched, because of organizing, because of the pressure campaign, what Joe Biden got up there and said is, it's not about to be like the police are the problem, but he said, we ask too much of them, and we need a new approach that makes sure that Tyree Nichols and that murder doesn't happen again. What we need is to support the police to do the difficult jobs they're tasked to do, and we need to hold them accountable if they abuse their power or break the law. And look, when I think about Joe Biden and the work that we are doing as Vera Action to try and get the Democratic Party to actually own a message of we can have safety and justice, Joe Biden is the floor. So if we can get him to get off, fund the police, fund them, to support the police and have accountability when they abuse their power, that is a significant step forward. And then we have folks like Jose Garza and others, Summer Lee, who just beat back an incredible primary challenge in Western Pennsylvania, where she was called the defund candidate, the crime candidate. We can have others actually raise the floor altogether. This work doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't live with any one politician, not Joe Biden, not anybody else, but it is truly the work of incredible organizing and strategy and tactics in the moment. And these are small wins, but they are important wins to name as well. Our messaging guidance is on our Vera Action website. We've got a polling messaging library. Go to it. There's a lot around policing. And I'll just say to Terrence's point, when he said the police can't be the villain, what I know you mean by that and what we have seen in our polling is if you talk to the American public writ large and you name police as the villain and the problem for why we have the public safety we have, most Americans are actually not with you. Doesn't mean some aren't. Some very much are, right? And you got to know who you're speaking to, who is your base versus who do you need to persuade and bring over. And what we have found in our research with all Americans is fund the police or more police is actually not the winning message. It is support the police to do the difficult jobs they're tasked to do and hold them accountable if they abuse their power or break the law. It is the winning message not only with registered Democrats, but independent voters, Republican voters too. That is our new floor that still moves us forward, at least for me as somebody who's worked on criminal justice reform, a former public defender. This is the work I've done for 25 years, the work I will do for the next 25. That to me feels like a really important step forward. So just that sort of like level setting of what incremental but important change happens, and it's on the narrative front as well as on the policy front.
Two more questions.
Hi, thank you. My name is Lee Shull. I'm from Sandy Hook, Connecticut. And my question revolves around the fear and the counter-narrative and the reactivity that we all have. Fear has been used from the beginning of this country, and it is universally used against all these oppressed identities that are represented here fighting for rights this weekend. And it's a very simple message that they have, whether it's the NRA or somebody else's fear. We all have a much more complex task in getting our messages out, and we collectively are kind of competing for attention, for donors. How do we, well, one, I agree we have to be brave and counter the narrative, but that's on the back foot, right? How can we better collectively, collaboratively come together? It's great that everybody's here this weekend, but beyond that, what can we do to amplify and go on the offensive so that we're owning a narrative instead of always seemingly being reactive and supporting each other, right? Uplift everybody, because we're all fighting against the same type of fear, and it hurts everybody here.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that I would say is that any narrative that you hear is the result of a lot of work. Mm-hmm. And so the idea that we're just going to come together and have a narrative, that's not how it works, right? You actually have to think about going through the steps of what are you fighting for? Like, do we even have common language for the world that we're trying to build?
That part.
Right?
That part.
Do we even know that? How can you create a narrative if you don't have language for a world that you're trying to build? So I think the first thing to do is to get a common language. What are you trying to fight for? Because one of the problems that I think, and this goes to this, actually the success of their narratives, is that if you ask someone like, for instance, if you're like, I'm a progressive, and they'll be like, what that means, and they'll say, I'm anti-fascist, I'm anti-racist, I'm.
What are you for?
All you are doing is you've centered the things that you say that you're against. You actually haven't told me what you're for. You defined your identity by a rejection of other narratives, which means that you're centering those narratives. So I think that the first challenge is, what is the world that you're fighting for, and to define that. And the reason why I say that that's not easy is that how many places have you been in where that's been the thing that has been the focus of conferences like this for a couple of years, and then you get an answer, and then you start from there? Doesn't exist. It's one of the weaknesses they actually understand about progressives, right? That like we talk intersectionally, but we don't actually have an intersectional worldview. The second thing is that once you get to that commonality, you then have to do a lot of really intelligent brain work to come up with messages. So, for example, one of the best examples of a counter-narrative that sounds really simple, but was the result of an intense amount of strategizing and focus grouping and people who know a lot about marketing communications is Love Wins. Mm-hmm. Love Wins is an entirely different narrative paradigm shift around everything you were ever told about queer people. And it was really powerful. And it wasn't just something that they just came up with sitting, chewing gum in an office, right? There's a lot of money and intelligent brain work that went into coming up with that message and then figuring out the ways that you were going to seed it in a variety of different ways. That's the work that we have to do. It's not easy, and you have to be very serious about it. And it's not just about coming together and countering the narrative. It's complicated.
Yeah, look, I would agree with all of that. I think that one of the hardest things that we have to do with our narrative is determine the future that we want. And that future cannot be the opposite of what they want.
That's right.
Right? Who we want to be can't just be the opposite of who they are.
That's right.
Our position on crime cannot be their position with the edges softened a little bit. And so I think that has been one of the hardest things that I think the entire left is struggling with. I think a lot of Democrats are struggling with and I think that's a lot of what we see in this call for, I can't go there.
Something else.
Blame it on not feeling well, and you can take it
I'm
back.
not feeling well. I can blame it on that later. But that's a part of what I think we see in the call of leadership, in the demands of leadership right now, and the leadership of this party is it is a demand for a future, for a vision of the future. Mm-hmm. And if we don't get that from one candidate, then there is going to continue to be a pursuit, not just of can you win, but can you tell us where we're going? Even if we don't know how we're getting there, can you tell us what our aspiration is, what we hope to be someday? And then the last thing I'll say, and I don't want to keep harping on this, but we have to own our wins. And I hear you about the criticisms that we have to make of this administration, the criticisms that we have to make of the left. But I have been imploring the progressive organizations that I work with, like Campaign Zero and Color of Change and Black Lives Matter, own the wins of this administration. Because we marched and we protested and we voted. We banned the no-knock warrants that would have saved Breonna Taylor's life, and banned the chokeholds that would have saved George Floyd's life, and put 100 black women on the bench and conducted more pattern and practice investigations to hold police accountable than the last 3 presidents combined. That's not because of a person in the White House. Those are organizing wins.
That's right.
And we have to claim and take advantage of that. Because hope is a very fragile thing. And if we keep inspiring them to show up and march and protest and then tell them nothing is happening, nothing is getting better because they're not perfect at that White House, then we're never going to achieve the perfect that we're pursuing.
Hi, thank you so much. And also just shout out to the Netroots staff support. It's been really nice seeing them bring food.
Seriously, thank you. God sent.
My name is Kate Alexander. I work at Madre. We're a global feminist fund and advocacy organization, and we have direct partners in many places, Afghanistan, Yemen, also in Gaza and the West Bank, as well as doing advocacy work here. And I'm not sure we can have a conversation about public safety without addressing rising Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and the crackdown on protests, particularly on college campuses that we saw. It was such an extraordinary moment that I think was a real reality check on how vulnerable we are as the sphere agenda is winning, and it's actually criminalizing identity and dissent at a really alarming rate, where even our college campuses are not safe spaces for like political discussion and education. So my question is sort of going to be all over the place, but how, as sort of domestic organizers, do you think about the way that fear is normalized in U.S. foreign policy and is in fact rewarded when our politicians turn every debate stage into a bully pulpit? And how do you personally think about how the risk of the organizing work that we're doing when organizing is criminalized more and more and more?
I rarely don't have an answer to things, and I think that is just, you're touching upon the very hardest and sort of sharpest edge of this work around what it means to be safe and the deployment of police. I mean, one of the things that I will remind folks of, though, is there is the sort of conversation that is happening in what I will call elite media, of like the New York Times, and that sort of paints a certain picture of what is happening right now on college campuses is like sort of just a small, like it's over here. That is actually not what we are seeing online if you're monitoring media there. And it's not what we're seeing in the polls either. I mean, we are working in the battleground states right now, and in Michigan, like it is not actually a small sort of fringe thing to be deeply concerned about what is happening in Gaza, right? And to protest. So what I would say is, yes, I think we are at this sort of really scary precipice of where we are watching, because we are winning, the backlash come, and it's coming hard. And yet every single poll that we have done and what I've seen from others is that there is a real generational divide, and in our polling it's somewhere around 40 and under to 30 and under, where the sort of the the power of fear and that weaponizing of it, it just no longer holds with younger folks. And so when I think about what the slightly longer term, getting out of 2024, what the work is to do, it is to make sure that young folks who are protesting, who are making clear what they want to see in the world they want to see, that we are listening, and that those are the folks getting elected, those are the folks who are driving and setting the policy and the political agenda for elected leaders, and that we are thinking about media beyond the sort of like small elite, outlets that tend to dominate, but in fact don't reflect true public opinion. So I don't know if that really answers your question. It doesn't. It sort of gives us a little bit of a longer arc. But I actually think that that is what I see from both public opinion as well as like where true sentiment is and where I think momentum is. That was a hard question, a great one, and I'm really grateful to all of you for being here and for the great questions, for the great discussion, and thank you. Oh, we had 2 more? We are out of time, though. That's the, sorry about that, but I will stay for a little bit. I don't know if other folks can or not, but thank you. So grateful for this conversation. Thank you so much to our panelists.